couple of remarks about the collapse of the trial of HMA versus Andrew Coulson, and I fully understand that I'm sailing close to contempt of court by making these comments today, because much of what I'm going to say isn't reportable until tomorrow. However, I'm still going to make the comments I'm going to make regardless of sailing close to contempt. Because of the situation regarding contempt, I'll be the only one that's speaking. Gail's accompanying me, but I don't want her to be in any way, shape or form implicated in any potential future contempt proceedings. What the people of Scotland will find out tomorrow, and I'm sure they will share my mixture of disappointment and anger, is that the 4-year-long investigation under the auspices of Operation Rubicon, which has cost well in excess of £1 million of public funds and expended several thousand hours of police time, has collapsed. It collapsed after a ruling from Lord Burns yesterday, after listening to 2 days of defence arguments last Thursday and Friday, to the effect that there were 2 prerequisites for committing perjury in Scotland. Number 1, you need to lie. Number 2, the lies that you tell need to be relevant in some way to the case that you lied in. It would appear, and just for the record I'll state it clearly, that Andrew Coulson is a liar. And I'll state that tomorrow and every other day from now on, in no fear of contradiction and in no fear of any libel action from Mr. Coulson, because even his defence team would submit to the fact that the 3 witnesses who were called by the prosecution, who gave their evidence under oath, have shown categorically that Andy Coulson in 2010, over 2 days in a witness box in Glasgow, lied through his teeth about his knowledge of phone hacking at the News of the World, his knowledge of illegal interception of voice messages, his knowledge of Glenn Mulcair, who was on a £105,000 a year retainer at the News of the World. This man, in the witness box during my trial in 2010, categorically denied knowing anything about phone hacking until Mr. Goodman and Mr. Mulcair were charged by the police in 2006. Categorically denied ever knowing Mr. Mulcair or ever hearing his name. And the evidence in Edinburgh over the last couple of weeks has shone a light on that evidence and shown him to be a liar. Therefore, the second prerequisite that was required was relevancy. And this is where the Crown has to admit that they have embarrassed Scotland. They have embarrassed the legal and justice system in Scotland. They have let down ordinary taxpayers whose money was used to conduct a 4-year investigation but was not carried out properly. And the reason it wasn't carried out properly is because the Crown had a problem. And the problem is this: if they were to argue and admit that Andrew Coulson's evidence was relevant to my trial and therefore constituted perjury, they would then, in the very next breath, have to grant me an appeal against conviction. They would have to agree that my conviction was unsafe, based as it was partly on perjured evidence. Now, the question of the relevancy of Andrew Coulson's evidence in my trial is black and white. It was black and white to Lord Brailsford, who first, when I was represented by Maggie Scott QC, now a judge in Scotland, when she sought recovery motions via the courts to have documentation from the News of the World seized and released to us to build our defence, Lord Brailsford recognised that it was relevant and competent to my defence to investigate phone hacking and the practice known as the black arts. So Lord Brailsford granted our recovery motions on the basis that the evidence I sought from the News of the World in respect of phone hacking was competent and relevant. That's ticks number one box. Number two box is in the course of the trial of 2010, while questioning Bob Bird of the News of the World Scotland, the Scottish editor, I sought to question him about the practices of illegal phone hacking, about illegal surveillance, about bugging of cars, about doctoring of videos. And when I sought to compare a video that had been made about John Higgins, the snooker player, that had been doctored by the News of the World to make him appear to say things that he hadn't said, the Crown objected, and they said that it was collateral to the case. I argued it wasn't collateral to the case because my argument was that a video in my case had been similarly doctored by the News of the World. The judge in that case, Lord Brackendale, sought the weekend to consider the arguments. He then returned on the Monday of the 15th of November 2010, and I'll allow you extracts of this at the end of this press conference. But I do want to just read what Lord Brailsford said in my case in relation to this type of evidence. In the course of cross-examination of Mr. Bird, the Scottish editor of the News of the World, Mr. Sheridan explored the way in which the News of the World operated in terms of its approach to journalism, and in particular its use of techniques including payments to persons for stories and information, hacking into telephones, use of clandestine listening devices, the use of private investigators, and use of sources within police forces. Having regard to the evidence in the case and the line of defence identified, these are all legitimate and relevant lines of inquiry. Legitimate and relevant lines of inquiry. That's the prerequisite for committing perjury, that you give evidence that is relevant to the case at which you're giving that evidence. What happened in Edinburgh last week, despite my legal representative sending this material again to the Advocate Depute, Mr. McSporran, I say again because we sent it 6 months ago to the Crown Office, but in recognition that the judge was asking questions about what was the relevance of Mr. Coulson's testimony, why had Mr. Sheridan called him, we contacted the Advocate Depute by providing this material to him. Incredibly, he refused to show this to the judge. Lord Burns was therefore asked to consider the question of relevancy based not on what Lord Brackendale had already said in my case and had established the absolute relevancy of Mr. Coulson's evidence, but Lord Burns had to consider the relevancy question based on only what the Crown had presented in court. And as I said earlier, the Crown in court could not present the evidence of the relevancy of Mr. Coulson's evidence in case they prima facie established my right to an appeal based on an unsafe conviction. In other words, to break it down to layman's terms, the Crown in Scotland were faced with a choice. Do we try and sustain the unsafe conviction of Tommy Sheridan, or do we carry out a legitimate prosecution of Andy Coulson? And of course, when you've got friends in very high places and you're part of the British establishment, then Tommy Sheridan is expendable. Much better that we sustain an unsafe conviction of him than we bother about a legitimate conviction of Mr. Coulson. The third point I would make in regard to this argument, and it's a point I believe that Mr. Coulson's defence made almost as a taunt to the Crown in the course of this case. Why was I not called as a witness in this case? I'm the guy who called Andy Coulson. I'm the guy who questioned Andy Coulson. The judge was asking about the relevancy of the questions and the relevancy of calling him. The single person best equipped to be able to explain the relevancy, not from a legal point of view, because that had already been explained by Lord Bracadale, but from the point of view of establishing why he was called in the first place, was me. And yet the Crown refused to call me as a witness. Yet another example of their lengths that they are prepared to go to sabotage the conviction and prosecution of Mr. Coulson on the basis of trying to maintain an unsafe conviction of myself. So from my point of view, based on that evidence, and as I say, I'll let you have Lord Bracadale's ruling, which Lord Burns sadly and inexplicably has had withheld from him. Because of all of that that's went on, Lord Brailsford's ruling wasn't presented to Lord Burns. Lord Bracadale's ruling wasn't presented to Lord Burns. I, as a witness, was not called at the case. It is clear, therefore, that the Crown Office has deliberately undermined this prosecution in order to try and prevent me from securing a successful appeal against conviction. It has cost the Scottish taxpayer in excess of £1 million, thousands of police hours, 4 years of an inquiry for a shambles, an absolute shambles. We will now be the laughing stock of the legal world, that Mr. Coulson is able to secure a no case to answer on the basis of relevancy when the arguments are already there in black and white to establish that relevancy was at the very heart of his testimony in my case in 2010. The final point I would make is this. I have recently, and hopefully successfully, completed a 2-year law degree, and hopefully I'll graduate in November of this year. But it does not take a graduate in law to understand, a first-year student could understand, that the very first barrier you have to pass before you can present evidence in a case is relevancy. Relevancy. Does the Crown believe that Lord Bracadale, an eminent judge, would have allowed me to conduct the questioning of Bob Bird, of Douglas White, of Andy Coulson, all of the news of the world, all questioned on the techniques of phone hacking, the use of private investigators, clandestine listening devices? Do they honestly think that that judge would have sat and allowed me to conduct that line of questioning if it wasn't relevant? This, ladies and gentlemen, is a scandal. It's a public scandal. And what we're calling for is a thorough and full public inquiry into the collapse of this case. Any questions?
Where does this leave your move to have an appeal recommended by the Scottish Criminal Cases Law Commission? Because you had a bit of a blow at the start of last month. The door is still ajar, if not actually open. Does this strengthen that process in your view?
Rebel, it's an interesting question with probably two answers, because on the one hand, if Mr. Coulson was convicted of perjury, then undoubtedly that would have assisted the appeal. But our appeal was never based on his conviction, never based on that. On the other hand, the fact that this case is now collapsed and the Crown Office is now at the very heart of a shambles like this begs the question, what's behind it all? We have, for several months now, accused the Crown of being corrupt in the way that they investigated myself and my wife Gail, how they used evidence during the Operation Median from the News of the World. That was fruit from a poison tree. That was illegally obtained evidence that was used by the police. They are desperate to make sure I don't get to an appeal court where all of that can become a matter of public record. I have until the 9th of June for final submissions to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. My senior counsel has already given a very strong submission in my behalf. My solicitor has till the 9th to finish his submissions. I am confident that after hearing all of that and reading all of that, the Criminal Cases Review Commission will have no alternative but to refer this to the Court of Appeal. But I do recognise that the legal establishment in Scotland doesn't want that to happen, because when that goes to the Court of Appeal, all of these unturned stones are going to be turned over, and there's going to be a hell of a lot of corruption shown underneath them. Any other questions?
Are you going to Denver tomorrow?
No. I have to say, Rebel, in respect of that, Gail and I have been asked constantly since the start of the Andy Coulson trial, have we gone through to Edinburgh. I've got to say to you, I know the man lied and I know the man should be punished, but I take no satisfaction in the fact that kids are going to be denied the company of their father, or a wife's going to be denied her husband. We are not voyeurs in relation to that personal tragedy that was going to afflict that family. Now, it now appears as though that may not be the case. But the reason we were not there was because there's no glee to be taken from this. It's sadness. We know very well that depth of that sadness. Of course, we're told that the Crown has marked the possibility of an appeal, and we'll find out tomorrow whether they're going to appeal. I'm stretching my neck out right now and telling you they're not going to appeal. And the reason they're not going to appeal is because the appeal judges will then be asking the very same questions I'm asked here today. Why was Lord Brailsford's report not presented? Why was Lord Bracadale's report not presented? Why was Sheridan not called as a witness? And of course, what is going to be the answer to the Crown? They want to avoid those answers. They want to avoid that like the plague. Okay, any other questions finally? I don't know if some of you want to one briefly. Okay. Right, thank you.
So,